all the way from New Orleans.
I'm not nearly as entertaining a speaker as General Honore, and he introduced me as the conciliere, but I'd rather be the sommelier. What's the wine? What's the wine, guys? Whatever that one is, it's much better. Just to introduce myself, I have Andrew Jacoby. I have indeed been volunteering with General Honore's Green Army for about 10 years on environmental issues. I'm also an environmental attorney, aside from being a volunteer here. And in being an attorney, I work on environmental cases, and so I've had my ear to the ground on a lot of this. I've also been drafting legislation on behalf of public health advocates for close to 10 years. And I think our first abandoned oil fields bill that we drafted was about 8 years ago. And much of what I'm going to talk about has been unchanged. Things have gotten worse in the past 8 years. And so that's part of the story. And I'm going to tell you, I'm really going to make 3 points and then a big 4th point. The first, the 3 points that I want to touch on are that the abandoned well problem here in Louisiana has been getting worse. It's bad and been getting worse. That's a consensus. Nobody really disagrees with that, from the state to the lobbyists to the advocates like us. We all sort of agree on that. The second point is that both the state legislature and the state DNR have unfortunately not been helpful on this issue, and I'll explain a little bit more on that. The third thing I'm going to mention is that reform is badly needed right now, and I'm going to describe some of those reforms. The fourth thing I want to do is to push back and do the best I can to sort of destroy the what I would consider to be a regular talking point that has been wielded against the reform advocates like us, and I want to address it head on and as fairly as I can. So I'm starting off with a couple of photos here to just breeze through. These are photos from the Oilfield Site Restoration Commission, and they show you things like here is after Hurricane Isaac, and you can see where a tank started and where it ended. This is what happens when you don't clean up abandoned oil fields. These are orphan well sites. These are sites that never should have been abandoned. All the equipment should have been removed and the orphan wells plugged, but instead they're not. And then you have a hurricane come through and you end up with a gigantic storage tank about a mile from where it's supposed to be. And there are obvious implications of environmental and also public health when you're talking about oil and gas waste. And this is what we face. You can go onto Louisiana's public lands and in wildlife refuges, and you'll see these sorts of scenes. So I believe that this is a major problem. There's a consensus on this. I'm going to talk about a few definitions I'll get into in a second. The first is that when we talk about orphan wells and abandoned wells, some people call them deserted or zombie wells. Those are all fine meanings, but the word abandoned actually has 2 opposite meanings, because in the industry, abandoned can actually mean a plugged well. When you abandon a well, you actually clean it and plug it. And so when we think of an abandoned well, we think of a well that was deserted. I'm going to use the word orphan well here to describe wells essentially that should have been plugged but have not been plugged. Now there is an official orphan well list with the state. DNR maintains that. It lists about 4,600 orphan wells, which even the state agrees have been sort of abandoned and walked away from. But I think that that's really just the starting point. So a good working definition of orphan well is that a well that should have already been plugged, but that the operator has simply chosen not to. And the last thing is that plug and abandonment, anywhere you go, whether it's federal law or whether you look at the industry's own internal documents, plug and abandonment, also called P&A, means both plugging a well and cleaning up the site. That's a key point, because in Louisiana, oftentimes they will go and plug the well and leave the contamination there. And we all know that you should not do that. You should remove all the equipment, the storage tanks, the flow lines that might be sticking up in a canal and a boater can hit. That's all part of the cleanup process. So to move on to the next, I don't know where I point this. Oops, one back. There we go. What are orphan wells and where are they a problem? General already touched on this. I just want to mention we have a well that's sitting there. The difference between capping and plugging a well is that if it's just a little cap on the top, then you still have that oil well that's a conduit for oil and gas waste to come up. And as the years goes on, these oil and gas wells break down. Again, there's a consensus on this. You can go to the task force that the DNR secretary was on, and they mentioned the same thing. You have a breakdown of these oil and gas wells over the years, and so it's important to not just cap them, but to actually plug them. They can pose safety hazards. The oil and gas waste can get up to the surface where it comes in contact with humans. It can get into the water supplies if there's a cracked well. And the big problem here we have in this city is that even by the own measure of DNR, the amount of orphan wells is skyrocketing. And so that's the consensus. And what's not mentioned here is that improper plugging of wells is actually a huge problem. And there was a very important federal government study in which they found that 17% of wells that had been plugged were improperly plugged, which means that you can still have a big problem. So when Louisiana has, if you were to hypothetically say 20,000 wells, if you were to add that 17% figure to that, you'd say you think that a plugged well is fixed, but not necessarily in 17% of the cases. And being a state that's rich in oil wells, that can be a huge problem. So the orphan well, this is the official orphan well list. And I use orphan well in quotations because this is just the official list. In the mid-90s, the DNR was attempting to bring the number to 0, but as you can see, it's skyrocketed up. This is a COVID-like graph. This is a hockey stick graph. This is a tip of the iceberg also, unfortunately, because the total amount of truly orphan wells, as I'm going to show, is much higher than the official list. So how many orphan wells are there? I want to get into first the DNR official list is that there are 4,612 orphan wells. I wanted to point out that there was a 6-year study done. This was in the late 1990s from LOSCO, the Louisiana Oil Spill Coordinator's Office. They found 29,726. But this was not just wells. This also included tank batteries, waste pits. These are all dangers to people. So these are figures that you're not exactly comparing apples to apples here. And there are huge caveats with these official lists. Many wells, that's because on the official orphan well list, that's only what DNR considers orphan. But many wells linger unplugged with non-orphan status. The Louisiana Legislative Auditor found also that 37% of what are called active wells, which are supposedly producing, were actually inactive, meaning that they should have been plugged within 90 days of that status change. But they haven't been. These are just operators generally trying to cheat the system and avoid the monetary cost of plugging wells. So that's illegal, but it also shows you that the number of orphan wells is much higher. And I'll explain exactly why in a second. And of course, many also wells are on the inactive list, but the legislative auditor found that in about 86% of the time, Louisiana's DNR was not issuing compliance orders to mandate that the operators actually plug the wells. Well, that's a big problem because if DNR doesn't mandate that you do something, it's just not going to happen. So now DNR, and I've got some very positive things also to say about DNR, just to be fair, that I'm going to get into in a second here. This is Andy's list of truly orphaned wells, but I'm basing it off of publicly available figures from DNR itself. Now, my total here would be 20,607, but that wouldn't necessarily contradict with the general's estimate, because what the general's estimate, which would be much higher, and in my next slide I'm going to show you what's much higher, is that there are a lot of non-wells. There are tanks, there are abandoned pits, and there are different ways that reasonable people can differ on just what constitutes an abandoned well. I wanted to stick with something that is very fair and uses the DNR's own data. And so what I did was I started with that list of official orphan wells, and then I took a look at how many of these wells should have been plugged but were not. There's a bunch of different statuses here. This is a little bit wonky, so I'm going to go fast. I don't want to but you're all welcome to see this. I incorporated here that if we were to take the auditor's own figures, that 37% of active wells are actually inactive, meaning that they should have been plugged, that's another 11,173 wells right there. So you can easily start ratcheting this up when you just scratch beneath the surface a little bit. So the tip of the iceberg metaphor is actually apt here. Another is that because there's no future utility reform that's been beaten back for a long time, the concept that an operator can simply declare a well to be of, quote, future utility and then never plug it. They pay a $250 fee every year, which we fought over years ago. But if you have a future utility well in 10 years, that well is breaking down. And in Louisiana, what's not on here is that there are wells that should have been plugged a long time ago that the operator has said are future utility. DNR takes them at face value, and they've sat in that status for over 50 years. It's ridiculous to think that that's anything other than an orphan well, in my opinion, and there should be an upper limit. Most everyone agrees that there should be an upper limit. So I've added all these things together. I've shown my work here, and you're welcome to take a look, but I think that a very conservative estimate is going to be much higher than this, but at the very least, we're talking about over 20,000 wells, which is 4 to 5 times the size of what DNR's official orphan well list says. But here's why it's even higher. Because there are so many question marks and unknowns. And that's because Louisiana's DNR is underfunded to send inspectors out and to actually take a look at a lot of this stuff. There are, take status code 28, unable to locate well. Well, that means that somebody's been out there, they haven't been able to find the well, and that means that it's either capped or plugged, but they don't know because they can't find it, and they don't have any forms indicating that it's been P&A'd. There's good reason to think that they have not P&A'd it because they never submitted the form saying we P&A'd this, which means that of how many of those 2,596? I would think that a lot of them, but I don't know for sure. So you can add that on to my original figure if you want. Also, you have a lot of sites where you have an operating well, but abandoned storage tanks that are not being used, that are not safe, abandoned flow lines, people are, and those are also in a way orphaned sites, even if the well is not orphaned. In addition, there's these other caveats and additional points that means that, in my opinion, the 20,607 is really a minimum figure. So some of the problems, I'm going to mention there are some reforms that are needed. We've first drafted a list of reforms that are badly needed because there are so many loopholes that were created in both the DNR regulations and state law, and also in DNR policy. And in order to really address meaningfully the problem, we need to close all of the loopholes, comprehensive reform. You can't, it's like a dam. If you have 5 breaches in a dam, you can't plug one breach and assume that it's going to get better. You need, in order to create that hockey stick and to change it so that it's improving, you need comprehensive reform. So we need to fix the financial security. There needs to be financial security that's an adequate amount. There should be no loopholes. It should attach to the well so that it's always there no matter how unstable the last LLC is. And you need to have operators reporting production by well, flow meters on the well, just like they do in other states where they are a lot more responsible. And just so you know, in Louisiana, it's a $250 fee to stay on future utility. When you're in a place like Alaska, operators are required to put down a $100,000 bond. So we can do this. Other states, they do that. There's no reason that we can't do that here. So DNR, as you can see, despite the legal mandate, they have not been issuing compliance orders to 86.3%. Those are things that will address the problems. Some additional problems, the legislative auditor found the DNR was not consistently doing follow-up inspections. Again, I don't think that's necessarily willful. They're underfunded, and so while we try to push DNR, we also recognize the very difficult mandate that they've been given, which is basically a very underfunded mandate. So now a few other things are that DNR helps bad orphan well operators. If you have an orphan well, and this is just what General Honore was talking about, if you have an orphan well, then you shouldn't be able to start a new LLC and start operating more wells. You need to fix the problem that you caused in the first place before you're allowed to operate. But DNR makes it extremely easy. They don't keep track of the owners and executives of these orphan well operators, and they make it easy for people to simply fill out forms with very little information and start up new LLCs and walk away from their prior problems. That's a major problem. And another major problem is that state law absolves former operators to a certain extent who should be paying for the mess that they made. And I'm going to get back to that when I try to do my best to destroy the opposition's talking point at the very end of this, but this is a huge deal that foists a lot of responsibility wrongly on Louisiana small mom and pop operators and away from the bigger, often out of state like Texas big oil folks. Now, DNR's hands are tied, they're totally underfunded, but my beef with DNR is that despite being grossly underfunded, I think that they have failed to use what little authority they have, which is the rulemaking authority, to meaningfully address the problem, close every loophole that they can, because some of the loopholes are built into state law, but for those that are built into regulation, DNR needs to be doing their thing there. So, oops, let me make sure. So I'll make a brief history here on the problem, some of the problems. In 2014, we had the legislative auditor's report that came down like a pile of bricks on DNR and the state legislature and said you need 22 recommendations of problems to fix. In my opinion, it should have gone farther, but this is the legislative auditor. And when they came down, what you should have seen was a meaningful reform effort, but instead, we had the state regulatory agency and the state legislature going in the wrong direction. We had two legislative bills by two different legislators who are friends of the industry, and all they were trying to do was even just a little bit of reform, get some reform in. But the oil and gas lobby was very powerful in this state and managed to destroy those two even tiny little reform efforts. That was right after the legislative auditor had come down hard. And all they were trying to do was implement the basic reforms, a few of the basic reforms that the legislative auditor had called on. And then this is one of the real frustrating things is that DNR in 2015, when they took the stage, they implemented a rule change that made things far worse. They enshrined into law a financial security exemption for 75% of the wells. That's over 43,000 wells. It's a grandfather. That never should have happened. They should not be in the business of exempting wells from the financial security component. In fact, that's a issue that the auditor themselves brought up, and they said that every well should have it. But they passed a rule that absolved, by grandfathering, 75% of the wells. Their rule chain also allowed for blanket securities, which are bad. It waters down the financial security requirements. They failed to raise the financial security to even the minimum amount that the auditor thought that they should do. And then they failed to address when wells are becoming truly inactive. So they kept all these loopholes in there, and that was a major problem. After that, the 2016, that was a legislative task force report, they also hyped reforms as being needed, but then 2016, DNR issued an emergency rule that once again made things worse. They reduced financial security, and by a huge amount. We are talking about only a fraction of the amount of money that it actually takes just to even plug the well, not to mention clean up the actual site. So that was very disappointing because what this means is financial security in name only and the illusion of being protected with financial security. Because if the minimum cost is $7 a foot, and you reduce it to $1 or $2 a foot of financial security, it's not enough. It's just not enough. And we talk about Alaska, we talk about Colorado, we talk about Texas. In Texas, they addressed the problem head on, even in a pro-oil and gas state like Texas. And the oil and gas industry screamed bloody murder. They said it was going to bring the industry down and it was going to collapse the industry. And you know what happened? Nothing. They fixed it. They fixed the problem. They reformed. They pushed through all these huge reforms, and the industry kept on making money. It was not a big problem. It was just screams. It was empty. It was empty screams. So the emergency rule also brought back what they call the good operator rule, which absolves people of needing financial security if they're considered good operators. But the DNR doesn't even know who, in my opinion, even know who a good operator necessarily is. The legislature passed in 2016 an even worse rule once again. I won't get into it, but needless to say that it was bad in terms of financial security. It reduced financial security amounts, created loopholes, it allowed for blanket securities, made the problem a lot worse. So lastly, a few things, general principles. Every well should have adequate financial security. It should follow the well so that you don't depend on the viability of the last operator, which is usually this relatively small mom and pop. Production feeds need to be increased dramatically. In fact, even LOGA's own president has admitted that they need to be at least doubled, but you'll never see them say that again, I don't think. But DNR should have increased funding for more inspectors. We need to go out and identify these actual sites. People who have orphan wells in their background should not be operating anything until they properly plug with their own money the orphan well, period. Truly future utility wells, I'm personally okay with that. Just every state has that, but you need to take a hard look to make sure that you aren't hiding wells that should be plugged in future utility status. And P&A work should always involve cleanups, careful environmental sampling of the problems so that you're restoring this to its natural conditions so that hunters, boaters don't hit flow lines, you don't have problems. And I'm just about done, by the way. These are the specific reforms in a little bit more depth, but I won't bore you with these. You're welcome to see my presentation. But there are a couple of curious loopholes. I want to just highlight one as being very counterproductive, which is the first one, which is that there is enshrined in law here in Louisiana a provision that says when public funds are used to clean up one of these private sites, that the state cannot go after the former earlier operators from years past unless a $250,000 threshold is reached. It's an arbitrary number.
Bobby Jindal. Going out the door present to the oil and gas company.
One of the presents there. But it's really, to take what you said, it's not just a gift to the oil and gas industry, because these sites are sold down the food chain from the big oil operators of Exxon and Shell, and they eventually are operated many years later after a lot of the damage has been done and the contamination has taken place. They're sold down the food chain to Louisiana mom and pop operators who are not in a position financially always to handle this. But what this law does, this favors out-of-state big oil like Texas big oil, Exxons and the Shells, and it absolves them of having to pay for the mess that they made and foists that on what are typically the Louisiana operators. Only in Louisiana, Texas would never do this. Only in Louisiana would the oil and gas industry push through these bills that favor Texas oil companies over Louisiana oil and gas operators. That is the sort of reform that you would think that everyone in this state would get behind. And sometimes they will tell you that in private, but they won't tell you that in public, because the oil and gas industry it's too powerful. It's too powerful to push through some of these reforms, which is why a very pro oil and gas senator like Senator Elaine attempted to get even a little bit of reform, and they took his bill down too. And it takes a lot to take down a Senator Elaine bill. He's often been against us in a lot of positions, but on this, he was in favor of the right thing. But even his very small reform was taken down. So a few more of the reforms, I think, and I won't dwell on these, but they are elaborations of what I said a few seconds ago. And I want to talk about two more slides. The first is the Oilfield Site Restoration Commission. And I think that reform is desperately needed here. It's been the subject of some op-eds recently. The Oilfield Site Restoration Commission, to explain a little bit what it is, it's a public commission, but by law, certain lobbyists and even environmental interests are allowed to nominate people for this board. So you have a board that's composed of private interests and in part private oil and gas interests, but it's a public commission and they have power over public funds. And they have a lot of other powers, which I've listed here, but what you can clearly see is that they have a lot of oversight and management roles over publicly funded cleanups on private property. And in my opinion, there are conflicts, incentives, and disincentives. What happens when a former operator who has a position on the commission is getting his site cleaned up with public funds rather than funds from his own pocket? If he makes the mess or contributed to the mess or operated the site, why shouldn't he clean up that mess? And why should it come from public funds? In my opinion, we need to take a hard look at this. We've learned from what's happening with in Baton Rouge with the Capital Area Groundwater Conservation Commission, where you have a problem where you have commissioners who have an interest in managing an aquifer. Well, here you have an interest in managing a different kind of natural resource. And you have a danger of public funds being used to clean up private sites where there are private operators who should instead be cleaning up those sites. And so I think that a thorough audit is needed. I'm not saying that the people on the commission are bad or corrupt, but I'm saying is that as a matter of good governance, that the people who are professionals at good governance, like the Louisiana Legislative Auditor, should be taking a hard look at this. And it's all the more important because, as you see on the last bullet point, we are expecting a giant dollop of federal funds through the Biden infrastructure package to be passed through to Louisiana to address oil and gas contaminated sites and plugging and abandoning local Louisiana sites. We need reform now so that when those funds, when that huge dollop of funds come in, it is very carefully managed in a way that is without a conflict of interest. So there's too much money at stake, there's too many public health hazard sites at stake that are really big. So I want to conclude by attempting to address head on what I consider to be one of the regular talking points that you will occasionally hear, whether it's from state legislators to oil and gas lobbyists themselves, which is that it's bad for Louisiana business and bad for Louisiana contractors. It's bad for Louisiana workers to force companies to clean up these sites. But as I mentioned before, the former operators tend to be the bigger, often out-of-state, Shell, Exxon in Houston. There's a lot of money that they have made from Louisiana, harvesting Louisiana resources. And they've taken those profits in big trucks and hauled them off to Houston and built gigantic subdivisions with very shiny cars out there. And it is actually, it would be, if our reforms would be pushed through, very good for business if you would require and hold them accountable to what they've already promised to do, which is to use a small chunk of the huge profits that those out-of-state big oil operators have made and actually invest that tiny sliver of profit back into Louisiana contractors, to hire Louisiana workers, to clean up Louisiana sites, all for messes that were often made, at least in part, by Texas operators and other out-of-state operators. That's actually good for business. Hiring Louisiana oil field workers is good for the economy, it's good for their jobs, it cleans up the environment, it protects the public health. This talking point that it's bad for business should be reversed. There is obstruction here, the reform obstruction by the oil and gas lobbyists has simply not helped Louisiana workers. So that's what I wanted to point out. And if anybody wants to, I've got at least one question here. You want me to take the question?
Oh, we're going to get the question in 1 minute.
Okay.
Stand by right here, Andy.
I will.
Good job, Andy.
Thanks, guys.